Oh, I'm Gail Killough. This is my presentation regarding the matrix for class EDLE 731 with Dr. Madison. And this matrix and my corresponding literature review is about learning from the integration of Vietnamese students. Review for this matrix and for the upcoming dissertation. My plan for my dissertation is for it to have an Evansville Promise neighborhood focus. And then within that, I'm particularly looking at current immigrants and homeless students, as there is a concentration of those groups within the Evansville Promise neighborhood. In particular, I'm looking at students that have had unstable housing situations, maybe have moved around quite a bit or have had major moves. And so there's more to consider for the learning environment. So this is going to be for students that not only have a history of an unstable living environment, but also, therefore, an unstable learning environment. And the ideal is really to have what are the best practices, evidence based practices for community school partnerships regarding that. So I think there are lessons to learn from previous immigrants to apply to those that are currently either immigrants or have unstable housing situations. Have a broad topic in mind for my dissertation, and I do realize that I will still have to narrow it down. This is my third literature review for the dissertation, and it kind of fits in between the first two that I did. I started out first with neighborhood indicators of strong schools. Depending on what studies you utilize or look at for evaluation, there are potentially 47 neighborhood indicators that basically can help determine pro and con regarding strong schools or weak schools. Then my second literature review really had to do with the educational funding for schools to aid homeless students. And the background for this is starting in 1987 with the first McKinney-Vento Act, and then later solidified with the second McKinney-Vento Act. Schools were rewarded dedicated federal funds to help homeless students, keep them stabilized, keep them in their schools, provide the supports they need. And this funding came from the U.S. Department of Education, through the Indiana Department of Education, and this is something that we've had a lot of success with. Starting in 2026, we are losing the dedicated funding for those funds. So now, basically, those funds have to compete in a much bigger pool. This is at both the federal level, there's been some restructuring of what is left of the U.S. Department of Education, but more importantly, Indiana Governor Braun has requested that all educational funds be basically given as one big pot, and that then it will be determined how those funds are provided. So there is no longer going to be dedicated funds just for homeless and vulnerable students to keep them stabilized. The themes for the matrix and the corresponding literature review were chosen beforehand. I wanted to make sure that the literature review contained different viewpoints and came from different directions and really had a comprehensive approach to it. Since I am a community development specialist, and I'm wanting to really focus on what community development supports, help students and help schools to provide the best education to students. In particular, I'm worried about vulnerable students, homeless students, and immigrants as they do not have stable housing or at least have a background of unstable housing, and there needs to be additional considerations for those populations. and this corresponds with that. And then, the Promised Neighborhood is, a topic where there's already been a lot of research done on it. However, most of the evaluation has been done by the Urban Institute, and there's some pros and cons to that. But in particular, for this third literature review for me, I really wanted to look at the lessons learned from our Vietnamese refugees and students. This came about because I went to an elementary school in my younger grades. I actually kind of probably got the tail end of the wave of Vietnamese refugees being students. So I went to school with those that were considered Vietnamese refugees, and they lived in my neighborhood. And for several years, I interacted with them. So that definitely had an impact on me, and then made me want to think that as a community development specialist, we really should do a cultural preservation project for our Vietnamese refugees and our local residents that have a Vietnamese heritage. So I also will be using this information and literature review for my work as well. Related to that is so much of the literature really just talks about the migrations and integrations. The students oftentimes went through several countries before they even came to the United States. They had to be sponsored. Majority of the time, they were sponsored by a church, and so much of that is about that, and that seems to correspond with how even second generation Vietnamese students are doing so forth. Something that I would like to pursue further is there's really starting to be some dissertation and some reports, and just looking back on the Vietnamese War and the Vietnamese refugee situations for those that are now second or third generational Vietnamese. So that's something that I will want to look into further. But most important, I really wanted to look at the school's approach. I remember when I was a student that there was someone hired that specially worked with the Vietnamese students, and that they had guidelines and curriculums, and that it was something where it helped to integrate them into, to the learning environment. And really also a lot of it is about instructional materials. So several of the articles that I chose are really instructions. Something that I wound up running into in this case is so much of the information is older. Normally, I would choose not to go more than 10 years back. However, I did choose a few what I will call hallmark documents that kind of gave me an idea of how things were being approached in the late 70s and in earlier evaluations. Overview of my actual matrix. I chose 20 articles for this matrix. My actual literature review will include more references, but there are more secondary references and more historical references. So these articles are more about the dissertation topic of how can we learn from how we taught Vietnamese students and how we either integrated or didn't integrate them. There's quite a bit of a mix of the articles. I do feel like they fit together. Something that was a common theme was the two generational approach. And the most important aspect of what worked with Vietnamese students and seems to also work with current immigrants is the ideal of a whole household education immersion. And so this fits very well with a community and a school partnership. Relationship building with students and was very critical. What I think will be probably the next wave and the biggest wave of studies is really looking at the viewpoints of second and third generation of Vietnamese refugee viewpoints as they recollect on what they have been taught and how they, fit in with, society as someone with Vietnamese heritage. Overall, though, I think this is a good study, and I'm very much interested in applying this to my dissertation.